Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SITREP. SITREP is an notorious open source intelligence app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and stay informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SITREP, for sponsoring this episode.
Welcome back to The Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer for Artorias. And in today's episode, we are going to be covering the latest developments impacting Western Africa and the Sahel with my phenomenal co-host, Matthew, who is an expert in this region. And if you are a regular listener of ours, you know Matthew loves to always bring up examples about the Sahel and bring it up. And I think there's so many issues and news that have happened just in the last week in and of itself that we decided that, this is a major topic that we wanted to bring to our listeners and really go deep into the details because of the significant amount of news that has happened. And Matt, the first question I'm going to ask you, today as of this recording, June 6th, earlier in the morning, we kind of got some breaking news that Wagner has declared basically mission accomplished in Mali and that they're pulling out of the country and kind of ceasing all their anti-terror operations. I guess it kind of gives the vibes of, the George W. Bush famous, in the aircraft carrier mission accomplished in Iraq and all that kind of happened. So my question for you, Matthew, is what's your reaction and your take on the Wagner announcing withdrawal in Mali? And does this mean also that a Russian military presence in Mali is going to completely cease, or is it just simply going to transfer over to, let's say, the Africa Corps or a separate Russian PMC?
So I'll start with the last part first. It's not going to cease. The Africa Corps is going to be staying in Mali, but you can expect them to be more centralized in Bamako. You can expect them to focus more on training than actually conducting the missions in the way that Wagner was trying to conduct these missions. It's silly for Wagner to claim that they have completed their mission because they really have been much more ineffective in combating these Salafist groups. And, we've seen this with JNIM, but not just the Salafist groups. We also saw in July of last year where there was a Tuareg ambush against the Wagner group, which actually killed the leader of the Wagner operations within Mali under the call sign Lotus. And it also killed Fedini, who was one of the administrators of the famous Gray Zone Telegram group. We know also 500 was another call sign of one of the administrators. He was killed in Ukraine, but that was an absolutely devastating instance for the Wagner group. And that was not even the Salafists. Those were Tuareg groups that conducted that ambush. So we haven't really seen them show any capability, even close to the French or the French when they were supported by the United States, to conduct these counterterrorism operations. The borders in the tri-border region, which includes Burkina Faso and Niamey or Niger as well, they have not been able to secure or surveil those borders, and as a result, they've become more porous, and it has led to the groups, specifically JNIM, but also the Islamic State and the Greater Sahel, being able to tap into smuggling networks. And, often they'll pay them or provide protection to them to increase their ability to conduct these cross-border operations. And what we've seen recently has focused mostly in Burkina Faso, primarily in May, and we saw a pivot north to Mali in June. It really seems like there's no one protecting those borders. And for now, Niger has not experienced many consequential attacks. There was one in late May, but for the most part, it seems like JNIM is the primary actor, and they are targeting Burkina Faso and Mali, and it really shows their reach into both of those countries right now.
So actually, let me quickly follow up. I have a follow-on question of something else, but I really want to focus on this last piece you're talking about. And just in your opinion, we do get. I would agree with you. We are getting more reports of, if you compare to the three countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, kind of what, and I think it's important for our listeners to know, for the intents and purposes of this, that's kind of after all these military coups that overthrew the governments in these countries and were ruled now by military juntas. That kind of very carried this very nationalistic, very Africa, country first, and almost like this African philosophy. In these countries, they formed what's called the Alliance of Sahel States, and it's kind of this alliance between the three countries, kind of a mutual defense pact. But out of the three countries, it does look like that JNM and even ISIS in the Greater Sahel. My question for you is, because in my opinion, it looks like it's between Mali and Burkina Faso, the countries that suffer the most amount of attacks, and then Niger is the third. I mean, would you agree with that? And which of the three do you think receives the most? Is it Mali or Burkina Faso?
So recently, I mean, that's tough to tell. I would say of the major attacks, you're looking at five of them in Burkina Faso in May, and then four in late May and June in Mali. But it's important to keep in mind that Mali is sort of the base of operations for JNIM. There is a large swath of area that is just more or less lawless. Even in Burkina Faso, we're talking about a government that controls less than 50% of the country. So I think they're taking advantage of this porous border, and I'm not sure that they even really respect the borders. Like Djibo in Burkina Faso has been under siege for a long time prior to this major attack, and we're talking 200 plus casualties in that attack on Djibo, and it was much more complex than some of the attacks that we've seen in the past. It's also important to remember that around the same time last year, we saw a significant uptick in attacks in May, June, and somewhat July and August. So it's maybe sort of like the fighting season, if you can think of it that way. But we also have problems because all of these countries are led by juntas and they're not disclosing the number of fatalities. So we rely purely on numbers that are coming out from the Islamic groups and then trying to confirm them via journalists on the ground. But we don't have a clear picture, especially in the West.
So then, Gabby, I love this conversation because every time I think I have a question, you bring up a point, and I just have to follow up with a separate one. So my question to you then, I mean, I guess it's twofold. Before we go to the Wagner or Africa Corps piece, just focus in the Alliance of Sahel States. Is number one, I guess what you're seeing on the ground is that the situation is worse since these coups happened, and the security in those countries has kind of significantly degraded, as in, and that was a major reason for the coup, was like the instability was so bad. So it does look like the situation on the ground is worse. But then the question then becomes, is there a risk of these leaders in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, these junta leaders, is there a significant risk of another coup that might overthrow these governments? Because that's something that, these governments, these juntas have a lot of, they have tried to really solidify their political control of the countries and the politics and all that, and they have a very authoritarian rule. So the question is their regime stable, or is there a concern that there might be a coup because of the violence of these Islamic groups that were the cause of the original coups to begin with?
So right now, I don't think that's likely. And one of the things to keep in mind is these juntas are very focused on their own interests. And so, like I was talking about before, I think you'll see the Africa Corps filling this gap and they'll be providing close security to these juntas. And they'll also be providing training to the military, and I don't have the same concerns, or I guess in this case, hope that we will see coups within this country anytime soon because they're very much focused on securing their own interests and their power versus securing the country against these internal threats or external threats. So it's not something that I see in the near term, but I do think over time, if we continue to see this and we continue to see these high numbers of casualties, and if we continue to see these more complex and planned out attacks, potentially there are going to be people even within the junta itself who are displeased. And that is the biggest threat because that is, when we've seen coups in close succession, like I believe Niger saw two. We've seen multiple coups across the whole of the Sahel. It's normally people who are entrusted with the interests of the current junta who are capable of overthrowing the current leader. So in the moment, I don't think there's a high threat of impending or incipient coup, but it could be something that we should watch over the course of the next few months, over the course of the next few years.
So, going to the Russia piece, I guess I have a two-part question for you then is number one, it looks like the new focus for the Africa Corps, now that Wagner announced they're pulling out, it looks like the Africa Corps, as you alluded to, is going to basically have two missions. One, more of like, from a military perspective, a U.S. military term, if I can use, it's more like an advise and assist. In other words, they're not going to be in the forefront of doing counterterrorism operations in these more remote areas against JNM and ISIS in the Greater Sahel, but rather just advise and assist, and then also focus more on, junta security and regime security, providing that kind of personal protection details, something probably similar to what we're seeing now in the Central Africa Republic. So that would be mine. Is that kind of where you're analyzing where the situation of these Russian groups operating in the Sahel, is that kind of what they're focusing on? But the second one also would be, I mean, what's left for Wagner? I mean, is this kind of the death of Wagner as we know it? Because I mean, they're not in Syria. Bashar al-Assad is gone. So after Bashar al-Assad fell, the only thing left for Wagner was these, in Africa, and they just lost. We don't know the reasonings unless you have some sort of inside knowledge, and maybe you can talk about it, why they're pulling out of Mali. But it looks like Wagner is now pulling out of the Sahel. Is this kind of the death of Wagner as we know it?
So again, going with the last question first, I think this is something that we've talked about in the past. There has long been bad blood between Wagner and Russian MOD because they were taking funding. And now that the Kremlin has more direct power over the Africa Corps, I think they're going to become the favorite when it comes to these situations. I'm not really sure what Wagner's goals are at this point because, early on we were looking at when they got involved in Mali, uh, them potentially trying to secure mining sites for bauxite, and trying to get some of that money back. And obviously there would be a tax that some of that would be paid to the Kremlin. But without Prigozhin, without Utnik, I don't know that they have the influence that they once had. And it really seems like they're tucking tail and leaving. And I don't think that there's anything left for them to do. I don't think they have the influence within the Kremlin. I wouldn't be surprised if some of these fighters, a lot of the very proficient ones, were trained by the GRU. So they'll either be absorbed back into the military infrastructure of Russia, or they'll end up working for the Africa Corps. So I do think that this is kind of the death knell of Wagner as we've known it. And we've been seeing that for years. A lot of like their premier operators have been killed in Ukraine, have been killed in uh, Mali. It's just not the group that it once was.
And I guess the follow-on question is, goes along so you do believe that the Africa Corps' now focus will be internal security for the regime and kind of advise and assist, or what do you think they're going to be prioritizing now that Wagner's pulling out? I'm assuming the counterterrorism piece is kind of done for them, or do you think that still might be a continuation of Russian military operations in the Sahel?
The only thing that I could see them providing beyond this advise and assist role is potentially working with whatever aircraft are available and maybe sending some pilots. That's one of the things that Wagner had been providing because right now, as I was talking about previously, the intelligence gathering is certainly lacking, and they're really not able to control the borders at this point. And so if if the junta is thinking, okay, we need to stop this cross-border travel with this group, and we need to really crack down on these smuggling lines, one of the ways they could potentially do that is to ask the Africa Corps for pilots, so that they can start observing those borders and maybe trying to crack down on those smuggling routes.
But I guess the question then is like, okay, I mean, look at Russia. Let's be frank. They lost Syria. Yeah, they still have a naval presence in the Mediterranean, but that's it. I mean, the new Syrian government doesn't really care about Russia. They're focusing more on, I mean, clearly right now, the player that's getting the most amount of influence in Syria is the United States. I mean, that's kind of an interesting development. You look at the situation in the Sahel, the Russians are doing poorly to try to stabilize the region. But but the Russians are so consumed with Ukraine. I mean, we saw this very successful attack against, the Russian strategic bomber fleet that the Ukrainians did. I mean, can Russia really do anything to change the situation on the ground and commit for more forces? Because it looks like they can't even handle Ukraine. Can they really do much differently in the Sahel? And is this that maybe Wagner pulled out of Mali because they need more forces for Ukraine? Do you see Russia really being able to do much different in the Sahel now that they lost Syria and they're still consumed by Ukraine?
Honestly, I'm not sure. We've seen them continue at least in 2004 or 2024 to supply some of their actual operators, like these people who are trained at uh, Okino, which is a base that is co-located with the GRU. Some of their actually proficient operators were being sent to the region, but can they afford to do that? I feel like Russia right now, like you were saying, they're kind of on their heels. And I can't imagine that they see the investment, especially because they were not able to monetize Wagner's presence there the way that I think a lot of people thought that they were going to attempt to do. And with that said, I think if they are trying to monetize their presence, Mali is not going to be the location. So mining bauxite is, which is something we don't hear a lot about, but it's a key component in the construction of like aluminum, and it's going to take a lot longer to get that out of the ground to process it than something like gold, which is much easier to process and much easier to mine. I think what they would do in that case is turn their attention to Libya, because we know that they're backing Haftar, and Haftar has created a much more successful campaign against the UN-backed government than I think a lot of people thought he was capable, even just 5 years ago. Um, and the oil there is going to be the easiest way to get some sort of pay or some sort of um, investment that they could benefit from in the long term. So I would imagine that Russia would be more interested in increasing their backing of Haftar.
So let's speculate for a little bit. If, let's say, Russia completely pulls out of the Sahel, do you see any other country willing to step in? I mean, the French pulled out. I don't think there would be a political desire for France to recommit troops to the Sahel after kind of what happened. The United States under President Donald Trump has been very clear that their priority is the Indo-Pacific, and then Iran always screams its head and said calm, and then still the Russia-Ukraine war. maybe I don't see the United States really stepping back in. But and who else is there? Do you believe France, the U.S. would recommit? Do you think a new player might show up, possibly Turkey? If the Russians pull out, who do you think might replace them, or even maybe China? Who would give that security umbrella to these juntas if the Russia pulls out?
Well, again, I think Turkey's more interested in Libya. The United States legally cannot support these regimes unless they commit to having elections. So it won't be the United States. France has completely washed their hands of this. I don't think any of the juntas would even want them there, because that is what led to their early popularity was this anti-Franco, colonialization feelings that and grievances that existed in those countries. The UN's not going back, especially without France, because none of the countries that were involved in that mission outside of France helping through Operation Barkhane were capable of providing the support to make it a successful or even um, feasible mission. So no, I don't think anyone's going to be coming to the rescue of these juntas. I think the situation is going to get worse. And what I think the United States is going to continue to do is focus on countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Togo, Benin. They are going to Ghana. They're going to try and make sure that these organizations do not gain access to the Gulf of Guinea because, I've been talking about these smuggling routes and, we have seen attempts, and I believe some of them have been successful to increase these routes across the Sahel and, trans-Saharan um, routes that they are establishing networks, and that's dangerous because it's going to make them more powerful. But if they gain access to the Gulf of Guinea, that's next level. And that would be a very big problem for the United States. It would be a big problem for uh, the Gulf countries. And when I say Gulf, I mean Gulf of Guinea. And it would be a very big problem for the countries within the Sahel. Like the only one that we've seen that has been semi-successful is Mauritania. And that's kind of the black sheep. Like you wouldn't expect them to be successful against these groups, but they actually have been.
So before we go to the Gulf of Guinea countries and kind of along the coast, I do want to ask you the specific question. I mean, Ukraine has kind of touted their success in supporting the Azawad movement or the Tuareg rebels against, the Mali junta and even Wagner and the Africa Corps, where Ukraine has provided material support to these groups to target the Mali junta and Russian groups. Is kind of like the if you will, the shadow war of the main Russia-Ukraine war, where Ukraine is now hitting the Russians and their allies. In Africa, we saw something similar in Sudan as well, where Ukrainian forces were in Sudan targeting and attacking rapid support forces in Wagner in Sudan. So my question for you, based on what you've seen, is the Ukrainian military activity supporting specifically the Tuaregs been successful with causing combat degradation in Russian PMC units operating in Mali, or do you just think it's kind of more of a token, minimal support, and they take more credit than they've really kind of committed in that theater?
Well, I can say that the ambush in July of last year was highly successful, but the Tuaregs are limited in the territory that they hold. They are somewhat self-interested, and who could blame them? But my biggest worry is that the Tuaregs sort of spill into Libya as well. And we've seen them attack on multiple occasions the El Shahar oil field in southeast or southwest Libya. Uh, and I don't think that would be a great look. I mean, it would be Haftar territory at this point, but I do worry, what other actions are the Tuaregs going to take that might paint Ukraine as facilitating things that are really against the interest of Ukraine and the greater Sahara and Sahel. But that said, they are a secular movement, and they are holding their own for the most part. Another group to look at is the Dogon. They've also established their own militias trying to prevent extortion from JNIM. A lot of these farmers are being targeted. They're having their flocks taken, they're having their grazing fields and territory taken. And taxes is one of the things that I think a lot of people overlook, but is a major, major funding source for a lot of these terrorist groups. And that's true across the Sahel, and it's true in Syria. Um, Wherever these organizations operate, the easiest way for them to make money, quick money, is extortion for protection and taxes.
It's funny that you say that because even in my own research, kind of focusing on not only Mexican cartels, but just criminal groups and organized crime groups operating in the Western Hemisphere, it was very important to highlight that the smuggling route from South America to Europe is not only transatlantic through these narco submarines and maritime routes, but it's also very heavily reliant on Western Africa, the Sahel, kind of the drug pipeline from South America through the Western Africa up to Europe. And the Sahel is a huge venue for these criminal groups and cartels to kind of really push drugs into Europe. I think it's important to highlight the country, a country in the Gulf of Guinea, has been referred to as a narco state, was Guinea-Bissau, right? And one first real true narco states in a long time, and to this day, it's probably the best example of that would be Guinea-Bissau. And I think these South American drug trafficking organizations heavily rely on these Western African countries for drug shipments into Europe specifically. But having said that, if we can pivot a little bit towards Western Africa, I mean, we did see Senegal is announcing that also France is pulling out from Senegal, the military base there. Gabon is another interesting question. So, before we go specific, kind of from an Africa focus, is this a situation where France, from a military perspective, is completely pulling out of West Africa, or are they still going to try to have some military presence somewhere? Where do you think French military role will be in West Africa this year?
Honestly, I think they're more than happy to leave a lot of that to the United States. I don't know if it's going to be a complete pullout, but they've been very quick to wash their hands where they're not necessarily wanted. And I think that has been to the detriment of a lot of those countries. And the United States has developed this warfighter recovery network after the attack in Tongo Tongo in Niger, which is where we relied on French forces to uh, evacuate our wounded soldiers. We said never again, but they've been a very close ally to the United States, and they haven't shown those colonial ambitions. And I really think that this is a situation where these historical grievances are going to end up really being detrimental to a lot of the countries that are forcing them to pull out. And I don't think that's a good thing.
So, what in the outside of the Sahel, kind of the three countries we focus on, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. I mean, we did see increased JNM activity in Togo. We've seen it in Benin. So what countries do you think are at greater risk of this JNM and these Salafist groups pushing into the Gulf of Guinea? Is it one of those? Is it Ivory Coast? What are the countries you're looking at that you are saying, okay, this is the next country that might have an issue? Because a lot of these African Gulf countries in the Gulf of Guinea are suffering attacks from JNM in the northern part. So where's your biggest concern right now?
So I think Cote d'Ivoire has been one of the ones that I've really been focused on and worried about. There's been a lot of Russian propaganda pushed towards Cote d'Ivoire. Now that Wagner is removing itself, we'll have to see how Russia conducts uh, propaganda operations and tries to influence these countries. This is kind of a changer. So I think this is a moment where We just need to sit back and see what happens in the next 30, 60, 90 days. But I worry about Cote d'Ivoire, number one. But I also worry about Ghana. I worry about Togo. I worry about Benin. So basically, all of those countries should be on people's radar when looking at where these groups are trying to influence. And I think what we're going to see is sort of probing to see where they can gain traction. And they're going to try and play off grievances. So we should look at recruitment from those countries and sort of how they're received. So right now, I'm not willing to put a pin on one country. Again, I will say the one I focused on the most would be Cote d'Ivoire, but really anywhere that they can try and establish some sort of uh, network that will allow them to access the Gulf of Guinea is where they're going to focus. And so probing is probably going to be like what we're seeing right now and continue to see over the course of the next few months.
So I guess then, I mean, is there any way that these African countries can change the dynamic on the ground? Because I mean, I think it's pretty clear, and anybody's listening to this podcast and previous episode we've done, is that the security environment in the Sahel continues to continue to degrade, um, and we're not really seeing any push to solve it or to at least stop the bleeding and try to stabilize the situation. So are you seeing any ability of the African Union, for example, or any regional government to try to step in to solve the situation? Or is this also a problem that we talked about in a previous African episodes, is that simply there's just too many crises? Because I mean, we haven't talked about Sudan and the civil war there. We haven't talked about South Sudan, the instability there. We have, and I mean, all these countries, if for our listeners, we talk about these specific countries and the crisis affecting them, Sudan, South Sudan. We talked about Goma and the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. We've talked about Mozambique. These are just to name a few, right? And so is this a problem? Is this just a situation where Africa as a whole has way too many crises impacting it and they don't have an ability to solve it, and the international community is not interested in stepping in because there's other crises, such as in the Indo-Pacific, such as in the Middle East, such as in Europe? Does Africa have any possibility of stabilizing and rallying around to try to stop these Salafist groups from pushing into the Gulf of Guinea? Or is this a situation where the Gulf of Guinea is going to have to just deal with the situation on its own?
I mean, I think we can look to the junta, the coup in Niger back in July of 23. And the immediate reaction from countries like Nigeria was, we're going to send troops. We're going to cut you off from ECOWAS. And that didn't last. And so there needs to be some sort of like actual commitment. And I don't know what country that could actually come from. And really to make a difference, I do think that they're going to have to lean on Western countries. So the first country that is willing to truly allow something like Operation Barkhane, again, would be the best suited, but we're not seeing that sort of outreach. We're not seeing them establish anything like that. The United States lost a lot of capabilities during that coup in Niger because, there were two drone bases that they were operating, 101 in Niamey and 201 in Agadez, and they've ceased to operate there. And so I don't know where that pushback is going to come from. It might come from the Gulf states. That would be my best guess. But in the meantime, what we're seeing is, I was talking about these networks, this Trans-Sahel network, the instability in Sudan, South Sudan, that is leading to the capabilities of these groups to reach out across Chad, which also has its own junta. That's where Operation Barkhane was previously based, and create these networks across all of Northern Africa. And I don't know where that pushback will or could come from. We don't even know that we'll actually see it. So, yeah, not to paint a gloomy picture, but at the moment, I don't have very high hopes. I think Algeria, Tunisia, but for the moment, they're not seeing the effects. So I'm not sure what their motivation would be. But those would be the countries I think that could make a difference at this point.
Hey, I guess I gotta throw this question then, because I mean we talked about all these countries we talked, and I just think that the big one that we're missing, the big economic player in Africa as a whole, but even in Sahel specifically, is China. What is China capable of doing anything? Are they going to do anything? Do they want to do anything? Where do you think China's role in the Sahel is with this increasing levels of instability and rise of Sahel movements? I mean, Salafist movements in the Sahel. What's China going to do?
So I think you could see China start to play a bigger role when their interests are directly threatened. But right now, if you look at where they're most profitable, it's going to be their Farsi fishing fleet, which is taking billions of dollars in um, revenue from those countries in the Gulf with this illegal, unflagged fishing fleet. And it's going to be their small scale gold uh, mining operations. If they feel threatened, we might see something, but we really haven't seen military intervention from China. I think they're willing to work with whoever controls the infrastructure and resources in a country. And I don't think they're going to bother touching or investing in areas that they don't feel are stable. That it doesn't make sense economically for them. So we really have not seen them to this point uh, really make any sort of military commitment to any of these countries, unless we're talking about the Belt and Road Initiative. And even then, it's just, can we build a deep water port here that our Navy can use in the future?
So I guess, what do you believe can kind of stop the bleeding of these Salafist groups like Jenim and Estes Greater Sahel? Like, if you had a magic wand, you can. So, is it a repeat of kind of the French military deployment into these regions with American support? Is it something else? I mean, if you were able to present an option with unlimited resources, let's say, or capabilities, what would be your option to kind of present to, let's say, the president of the United States to try to, stop this movement? Because, I mean, this is a big deal, and I think it's not getting the attention it deserves when we're talking about the aspect of the global war on terror, which I think a lot of people are happily to try to move away from, but it's still a very ever-present thing. And we've talked about how ISIS is shifting to Africa, and let's just look at Somalia. I mean, U.S. AFRICOM continues to conduct significant amount of airstrikes against Al Shabaab and ISIS in Somalia, but they're not doing anything in the Sahel. So, what do you think would be necessary to stabilize the situation in the Sahel? Would we need U.S. AFRICOM to be involved in the Sahel in some way, shape, or form, or what do you think is this? What do you think the solution might be?
Honestly, at this point, I'm not sure there is one, because when you look back to what happened at Tongo Tongo, um, United States Special Forces were ambushed in northern Niger, right on the Malian border, and four of them were killed. And that's the situation where we had to rely on French Cassavac. And a lot of Americans were shocked that we even had forces operating in that area. And, forget about the fact that Agadas, 201 was being built at the time, 101 was already operational. Um, so I think the American public is not interested in this type of operation, and the scale that it would have to be to do something about this. And we can't support the juntas legally. until there's some sort of democratic reform. So I guess the first step would be try and do some democracy building initiatives and try and back channel to the juntas to have some sort of election. I don't think they would be super interested in that, but we won't be able to directly assist in those countries until that happens. So the best thing I think we could do is continue to focus on the Gulf of Guinea and to try and work with some of the countries that these networks transit through. And if we can work with Chad, which I guess we probably can't because that's also a junta, but whatever we can do in back channels to destroy and make it more difficult for them to establish these networks and just ensure that they do not make it to the Gulf of Guinea. Use the allies we have, and build up and continue to train them to make sure that they don't fold and that those borders do not become porous. That's the first step. Long term, I don't really have an answer for that because without direct military intervention, which would be super unpopular, I don't know how we can combat what's going on in that tri-border region, or any of those, big three states, especially if we can't work directly with them.
I mean, I guess then from your opinion, is this the situation where the reason why the Sahel is not a focus from a U.S. and even almost an international community perspective? Is it just because there's just an exhaustion and people are tired from an aspect of the global war on terror, and there's now an aspect of near peer conflict, and that's why nobody's going to dedicate the resource? And then more importantly, is there a possibility that now the Sahel can be a vehicle for Al Qaeda, let's say, because JNM is an Al Qaeda affiliate, or the ISIS Greater Sahel, to start serving as a base of operation for maybe external operations into Europe and to the United States? Is there a possibility where we might see more terrorist planning from the Sahel targeting the West that then might require kind of a refocus and redirect of GWAT onto Sahel?
I mean, so I don't think that it is fatigue over the war on terror because I don't think enough people are even paying attention to what the United States has been doing or has done in the Sahel. And I think the French just washed their hands and said, well, if you don't want us here, see what happens. I don't think that is a good look necessarily. And a lot of the civilians are targeted by those juntas themselves. So it, I don't see how that necessarily changes. I really just think, the United States needs to focus on the Gulf of Guinea and make sure that this doesn't expand and see what happens with these juntas, see if, the situation on the ground becomes more advantageous and maybe there's in the future someone that we can work with. Um, But at the end of the day, I'm not really sure how we can truly affect what's going on there. And what was the second part of your question?
No, I mean, I think the second part of the question would be, is there a possibility that the Sahel might become a basis of operations for Al Qaeda and ISIS to conduct terrorist attacks in the West? Maybe they don't have the capability to reach because they're so isolated. Maybe in other parts of Africa, or do you believe that these groups might just operate more locally into the Sahel, and that's their only interest? What do you think the future of JNM and ISIS Greater Sahel is? Is it more international focused or more locally focused?
So I think right now, obviously, it's more locally focused. It really depends on how much they buy into, Osama bin Laden's 96 fatwa about the far enemy. I assume, they're familiar with that. I wouldn't be surprised uh, if once they have established territory, Right now, the majority of like most of those countries is not controlled by the juntas, um, but it's not necessarily a safe area. But I could see in the long run people going to these areas, people who might not currently be directly associated with the Sahel, but seeing an opportunity to bring that fatwa to fruition. So it would not surprise me if, especially with the ISIS affiliated group, that they would plan probably looking at Europe for attacks because I think that would be the easiest inroad for them. But given the right amount of funding and someone who is truly motivated, coming from probably somewhere in Iraq or Syria, if they see that as a safer area to plot, potentially extending across the Atlantic. But I do think that it is a greater threat for Europe at the moment.
Well, Matthew, I think this was a very enlightening conversation. I think there was a lot of things that we covered. There has been a flurry of activity and news there with and we wanted to have this conversation even before kind of the breaking news earlier today of Wagner pulling out of Mali. And I'm really thankful for the opportunity for having this conversation with you. But before we wrap up, I want to give you any opportunity to say any last parting words to our listeners and to see any recommendations that you might have for them.
I think the biggest thing I would say is do not forget, do not overlook what is going on in the Sahel or Africa as a whole. The population in Africa is going to continue to boom, and we have really two options, which is engage now or ignore it and face conflict later. So looking at things like USAID, these are soft tools that can be used to help these countries and build goodwill, and we shouldn't ignore that. Like at the end of the day, we have to work with these countries because they're going to only become more important um, as time goes on. And they have a lot of natural resources, and if they can continue to develop the extraction and utilization of those, it's only going to make them more important on the world stage. And if we ignore that, then it's to our own detriment. So that would be my final thought.
Well, Matthew, thank you very much for your time. To all our listeners, I think this is a key area of the world that does not get the attention that it deserves. And that's just something that we really wanted to talk about and something we really try to prioritize and specialize in this podcast, which is to give you the news of regions around the world that does not get the attention it requires and the detailed analysis, just as Matthew laid out in this episode. And so, again, Matthew, thank you very much for giving us your expertise. This has been the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast, and we'll see you next week.